And I want all of you to meet one of my most favorite people, and this is Genevieve Seger. And she's the granddaughter of John. Here she is, yes, the granddaughter of John Seger. I have his one. Did he write more? Oh, you brought yours too. Did he write more than one book?
No, but my father, who was the first white child born in western Oklahoma at Darlington, did a lot of work toward another book. It has never been completed.
Well, I think maybe you can complete it.
Well, I just have stacks of material.
Well, anyway, we are sort of just going to talk about the agency. I wanted to, when I called Genevieve, I said they had announced this class as Canadian County, as told by the people who lived it, Canadian County history. Well, Genevieve doesn't remember all of what she's going to tell us, I'm sure, but she said to me, I was taken there so often to Darlington and back and forth that she feels she did. I feel this way about my grandparents who made the run. I feel like I was along with my grandfather when he made the run into the Cherokee Strip. I really was, and I was about, quite a few years later, but we decided that we were going to talk about it, and the agency started in 1869, right, Genevieve? That's what I read. And Mr. Seger came to train the Indians, but I'm going to let Genevieve talk about it. But what we're going to try, and we haven't practiced nor tried this before at all, we're just going to both of us sit down. I think you can hear us just as well, Katie, and we'll both hear, and I can see all of your bright and shiny faces, and so I think it will work as well or better than if we try to stand up. It will be a little awkward. So I'm going to let Genevieve just start in, and if I don't quite get what she's talking about, I'm going to ask her a question, and we'll sort of just discuss Mr. Seger.
I really didn't get to see anime, so I talk it over, so I really don't know what you want to know. The things that I talk about are either taken from actual manuscripts written by John H. Seger, or things that I heard all my life. My father was Neotha H. Seger, Neotha Homer Seger. He was supposed to have been named John H. Seger, Jr., but since he was the first white child born at Darlington, the Indians were very, very curious. And they all wanted to come and see the little white child, or the little Neotha. And so they kept talking about the little Neotha, the white child. And so finally, he became known as Neotha Homer Seger, and in that way he missed being junior. Then I am the eldest grandchild, so that makes the third generation, and the times must have been very exciting. There was absolutely nothing in this area but trees and Indians and a few military people. Soon after President Grant was inaugurated, his Quaker peace policy was started among the Indians. And there was a feeling that if you were with all kindness and love, that you could do a great deal for them. And Britton Darlington came as agent, and Major Winecoop was a military agent, and he turned the commissary over to Agent Darlington. And Quaker employees came from many places. A number of them came from Iowa and farther east. And they soon learned that the theory was one thing, and quite another to put it into execution. It's like teachers are taught today in college. All those beautiful theories, what to do with children in the classroom, and it doesn't always work. The houses were rough cottonwood, which shrank and warped and they were cold and leaked and very miserable. And soon Darlington realized that they were going to have better quarters. And many of these Quaker employees, after they had practiced much love, got tired of having to lock their doors and hide from the Indians and being frightened, and they went home. And at one time, he was short of help. And of course, Darlington died in 1872. And he did a great deal of good because he was so beloved. The Indians respected him and loved him, and they loved his wife, Aunt Lucy. Now, the part history that I know the most about was when John D. Miles came from the Kickapoo Agency in Kansas. And it was Mrs. Miles, who was known as Aunt Lucy, I'm sorry. But as I say, Darlington was respected and loved, and Darlington is a place that has so much history. Of any place in western Oklahoma, it is one that should be remembered and studied, and you should be proud that it's so near El Reno. And John D. Miles had come from the Kickapoo Agency in Kansas, and he soon realized that they were going to have to do something about the buildings, so he had known John Seger, who was known as the jack of all trades. He was a man that was handy in doing most anything that needed to be done. He could plaster, he could build, he could handle all sorts of situations, and he really came down to help build some buildings at Darlington so they would have better places to live. And when he got down there, he found out that it was hard to get help, and they had to haul wood such great distances. And he worked out a method and found there was material for brick, and they helped make brick in this area.
Miles was also a Quaker, wasn't he, Genevieve?
Miles was a Quaker, yes. And oftentimes when John H. Seger used rather severe methods, he was cautioned to be kind and show your love. And John Seger well said sometimes discipline goes with love, and it is necessary to be harsh. And at that time, they were making every effort to bring the children into school. And they had succeeded in only having about 15 or 16 when they could at that time take care of 35. And with all the talking and persuasion, they couldn't get any more children. And so of evenings, John H. Seger was interested in the Indians, and when the other employees went into their quarters, he stayed out among the Indians and watched them. And one time there was an interesting incident. He tells when John D. Mills took charge as agent of the Cheyenne Arapahos, there was a sawmill to saw cottonwood lumber, the only kind of timber near the agency fit for milling. And of course the lumber warped badly. And there was little appropriation, very little money to buy building materials. And Agent Miles discussed the matter with Joshua Trueblood, who was in charge of the Indian school. And he said, if we had some employee who could plaster a house and lay stone foundations, build a chimney, we might build a respectable and comfortable house. What we need is a jack of all trades was his conclusion, and that's where the term started. Mr. Trueblood said there is a man on the Kickapoo Reservation who's a jack of all trades, and his name is Seger. If you could get him to come to do the work you would need to have done, your problem would be solved. Acting on this information, Agent Mills sent him and sent for him. And Well, Edna, I don't just word
Oh,
it.
you're just doing beautifully. There are just 2 or 3 things I want to
Yes,
say, and then
mhm.
we'll go ahead from there. Actually, Dr. Harrison, who's president out at the college, wrote his dissertation for his PhD on adult education in Oklahoma. And together we came to the decision that the first adult education in Oklahoma was teaching the Indians at Darlington to work in a sawmill and to make bricks. So Mr. Seger was at least one of the first teachers in adult education, which is what you all are participating in now, really. But of all of the places in Oklahoma, this is the place that it happened first. It always interested me in talking together to Genevieve. I had always assumed that Mr. Seger was Quaker, and she told me that he wasn't. He was a very good man, but he wasn't particularly anything, was he? I mean,
No, he didn't have he didn't belong to any particular church. He was raised in, I believe it was one of the Methodist churches, Methodist South, or Andrew Seger, his father, and their family. But he was a person that he wanted to explore. He wanted to go. He worked in lumber camps, and that's the reason he learned to chop wood and learned to plant trees. And he had worked many different places. He had served in the Civil War. His father Andrew Seger went to the Civil War, and in those days they had to bite off the end of the bullet. And his father's lips became so swollen and his face became so infected that he had to go home. And it was customary then that if a soldier went home, he had to send a replacement. So his eldest son, John Seger, replaced him. And he went on the march through Georgia. And I didn't bring today, but he has a carved big tooth comb that one of the slaves gave him because he was curious. He went, as he was soldiering and doing his duty, he was always exploring among the people. And he made friends with the Negro slaves, and he learned a lot about them. He was wonderful in psychology. And while he did not have a formal education, it was once said that he knew more about Indians than any man, and handling them, than any man in the United States. And at one time, he was offered Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And when the telegram came, his wife saw he didn't get it in time. But he wouldn't have anyway, because he said that he preferred to stay among the Indians, that he was giving his life to that sort of work. And he was good to his family and kind to his family, but it was always said it was the difference between his children and a little Indian child having a drink of water. The Indian child would get the first drink. And the family sometimes groaned and complained about that. But one time he went out of an evening and the Indians were coming in, and I don't find this place right now. They came in from their buffalo hunts, and they took all their family with them. They had their horses, and their sick, and the old, and the young, and the whole tribe went on this buffalo hunt. And when they came in, there was a huge cloud of dust, and the warning went out at the agency, everybody get inside. The Indians are coming back. They'll just take over. But he went on out. He was interested. And a little while, he saw the Indian squaws begin to take lumber that he had separated, the good lumber. And so he said, oh, they can't take that good lumber. And they said, oh, well, that's customary. When they first come in, they build fires and prepare their food and unpack, and you'll just have to let them. And he said, no, I won't. So he went out, and not being able to speak their language, he jumped up and down and screamed, and he was not a large man, but he did have a heavy voice. And he screamed and yelled at them and jumped up and down and pointed and told them that they couldn't use this lumber, but they could use this other pile that was discarded. And that is one of the things that he seemed to have that understanding. If I take something away from you, I give you something. And in that way, he didn't always say, you do my way and you do for me. I, in return, will do for you too. So the next morning, all the agency expected to have trouble because there was a lot of grumbling about this man that came out and wouldn't let them have this lumber. But the next morning they came into the agency and was bowing and scraping, not to the agent, but to John Seger. And later on he found out that they thought he must be a very great chief from Washington, or a very great important man that would come out in front of them and do all that gesturing and just take on so. And so they respected him in that way. And another time, before they went on their buffalo hunts, they brought their horses in and raced them for about a week before, so their horses would have strong wind so they could run after the buffalo. And they raced up and down, and they had a well, and they'd been bringing their horses in real close and causing it to be muddy and wasting the water, and it was very distressing. So one time he decided that he was going to put a stop to that, and each time he was warned that he was treading in very dangerous ground. But he went ahead and told them they couldn't come, and one came, and another one came, and another one came, and some of them pulled out guns. And he stood his ground, and he called to a man that was a blacksmith to go and get his gun. So he came out with his gun, and as he came with his gun, in the meantime, John Seger had picked up a good big stick. And before there was any shooting, he had begun hitting the horses with this stick and caused a disruption and took their attention on away from the shooting, and they all ran and left. And then another time, when they were digging a well, they were so short of water, they'd been hauling water, so he decided that he would help dig the well. And they couldn't find anybody that wanted to go down in a little bucket affair and get way down in the bottom of the well, because they knew there was quicksand there. So he went down in the bottom of the well. Well, after they were pulling the rocks up and letting this container down, the rope broke. And he saw it coming, so he jumped back far enough so it hit his nose and his forehead, and he bled profusely. So he wasn't killed, of course, and they all thought he was, and he yelled for help, and they pulled him up, and they doctored him, and they wanted him to rest for a week, and in 6 or 7 hours he was back supervising the well. Well, he had done some tricks, because they said we pay attention to the Indian man, the medicine man, and so he had learned in his travels from some circus magic tricks. So he had decided before this time that he would have the blacksmith make some rings, and I didn't bring them, I still have those rings, but there was a little break in those rings, but you couldn't see it. Iron rings, a chain made of iron. And so he would show the Indians, and they all looked at this chain, and then he'd jerk them apart and put them back together. And so he was very strong, and he had a knife made that was split with a little band around here to put in his wrist, and looked like it had gone through his wrist, and then he'd show that to them, and then he'd slip the real knife down, and they thought, and then he'd take it off, and it would show a place, and he didn't bleed. So he was a medicine man. So then they said, no, he isn't a medicine man, because his nose bleeds and his forehead bleeds. And if he was a medicine man, he wouldn't be. So he'd lost some face there. So the next a short time afterwards, he told an Indian he had a huge rock, and he had learned that if a rock is heavier than your body, that you could strike it and break it and it'll not hurt you. So he told this Indian to lay this huge rock on his chest and to strike it. And this Indian said, "Oh, we don't want to kill you. You haven't. We're not mad at you. We don't want to kill you." And he said, "Go ahead and do it." So he tapped it, and he said, "No, you hit it hard." So the Indian hit it real hard, and it broke. And so afterwards they said, well, he was a medicine man. If you want to kill him, you have to hit him someplace in his body, but he's vulnerable in his forehead and his nose.
What interests me so much about all of this, and when we're talking anything about Oklahoma history and Canadian County history, is the quality of the people that first came here. Personally, my grandmother came in a covered wagon. Personally, if it was up to me, I'd still be in the middle of Europe, you know, with my great-great-great, because I don't think I'd have the courage to do what John Seger and the people did who made this county. And he was extremely important because of his relationship with the Indians. It would have been much more difficult without people like Mr. Seger that had the sense to be firm rather than only kind. You know, without mentioning any incidents, we might learn from that in this time right now. That firmness and discipline is definitely necessary. And you know, of course, all of these people that came and settled this country had to be very disciplined people. Because, just quite frankly, I don't think I could do it. We have one other member, Mrs. Porter, is related to Britton Darlington. Mrs. Porter right back there that's doing the knitting. And
What tribe are these in?
Cheyenne, Arapaho.
there were two tribes here. Victoria, isn't it? The first name, yes. Victoria's here from, well, the last place she lived is Puerto Rico. And where did you grow up? Missouri. So she's, I think, more interested than the ones of us that have lived here. She's Mrs. Engill's sister. And, but we had the two tribes here, and the Cheyennes and the Arapahos. They really didn't like each other then, and they still don't too well. They're so different.
Did they teach them all the English, or did they have to pick up their dialect?
I was wondering about that.
John Seger decided that he got real interested in the school, and he decided it was through the children that they were going to do most of their educating. One time he went out into the camp, and he was told not to do this. They were told to not go over a mile from camp because they might be ambushed and they might, all sorts of things happen to them. But he was one of these people that was very inquisitive, so he went out in the camp. And one day, he sat through a ceremony where they dressed a young boy in warrior attire, feathers and beads, and he was dressed perfectly, and each one said, no, it should be this way and this way. And then they said to him, what are you supposed to do? And he said, kill the white man. And right then he decided that the children, it was important to the children. So he kept evenings, he went over to the school where they had this 15 or 16 children, and this man that was in charge was letting them just run around and hit the stove and just do any sort of thing. So John Seger decided that they should do something, keep them busy. So he started a round game of a little song that he had learned when he was a boy called Johnny Smoker. And you act out different things. You sing, and then you beat on a drum, and then you play on a flute, and you end up smoking a pipe. And it's a very tuneful little tune, and the Indians got very interested. And this man said, well, I can't understand. That's the first time they've been quiet. I just can't understand. So for about 15 years, he was known as Johnny Smoker. And many historians say that he smoked. There was one book written and said John Seger smoked a big cigar. There'd been a way to gotten big cigars.
No.
He went around smoking a big cigar, which he was absolutely against tobacco of any form. He absolutely would not allow it. And it's be very disappointing for him to think that because of the Johnny Smoker song that he was accused of smoking, which he did not do. He was a teetotaler, because one time he became very ill, and the doctor gave him some medicine, and it was rock candy and liquor. And about 3 weeks later, he went back to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, how'd the medicine do? And he said, oh, just fine. He said, did you take it all? And he said, well, no. He said, it's still up in the medicine cabinet. And because it had liquor in it, he wouldn't take it. So he definitely was a teetotaler. And another time when he was plastering, there was about 15 or 16 young boys kept writing. And the Indian boys and children were just like the white children, just difference of skin color and their way of living. And they'd write in it and take sticks and make all kinds of Indian hieroglyphics and signs. And so finally he went upstairs and thought they wouldn't come up there. And that was fresh plaster. And they went up there. So this man that was helping him said, well, we just can't have this. We can't get it plastered fast enough for these boys. And it never occurred to anybody in the agency that they could send the boys out. They was afraid of antagonizing their parents. And even today there are teachers that can't do the things they should because you're afraid of antagonizing the parents. So you see, history repeats itself. So finally my grandfather went outdoors and he said to this man, you shut the door and then I'll yell and make a noise outside and the boys will come down to see what's happening. But you let one out at a time. So as one boy came out, he'd grab him by the head of the hair and swing him around and throw him out. And the next one came out, he'd got him by the head of the hair and swing him and throw him out, till all the boys had been grabbed by their hair and thrown out. So he reported to the agent, and the agent said, well, now tomorrow we'll just have trouble. And they worried that night. They just knew the whole encampment would be in after them. And he said, well, I'm just getting tired of plastering and having those boys bothering us every day. And not a soul turned up the next day. The boys didn't come back or anything. And later on, he found out that the boys were too ashamed to even tell of the incident because they didn't want to say that 16 Indian boys were licked by 2 white men and didn't have a scar on the white man. So that was instances where you had to be strict. It might have seemed a little bit hard, but it was necessary. And another time, they had rations for the Indian children, and then the Indians were given their share of rations. But some of the Indian men particularly liked to hang around the school and be there right at mealtime so they could eat. And they were having trouble feeding the children, and they were so short of enough food because so many of these Indians were coming and eating with them in the mess hall. So Grandfather said to the agent, this is uncalled for. They have their own food, and this food is for the Indians. So he just stepped in and said, you have to stay outside. And they said, well, you mean you treat your visitors that way? You treat us when we come as your visitors at noon and at night, and you don't feed us? And he said, well, now this is for the children, and you eat your food. Now, if there's anything left, I will give it to you. And so there was much complaining. Oh, you just treat us terrible. But he made them go into another room and wait. But afterwards, he took what was left and took it into them and did give them food, you see. He kept his word. He gave them what was left. He had told them that if there was leftover food, they could have it. But they could not take the food that belonged to the Indians. And that is an important fact that even today, a lot of us do not understand the psychology of the Indians' viewpoint.
We've talked about this some together, you and I. Genevieve had an experience when she was teaching a child, an Indian, down at Union City, and she told me about it at the time, that one day there are many Indians in the Union City school system, or quite a few.
No, it was at East Walnut.
Oh, was it?
Principal out there, there's none
Well,
at Union
you tell
City.
about it. You remember when the boy came up and teach you, and one of the teachers said he's getting too familiar or something? This was only 2 or 3 years. Well, she told me, and I remember, because I felt that, they appear so often when you're and I'm not being critical. I want you to understand this. I was talking about this in another group, and the people thought I was criticizing the Indian, and I'm not. But they're different. And when you talk to them, sometimes you think they don't hear a word you say. but you have to be patient and just go on and talk to them. Now, some other races, you can tell by looking, and I can tell most of the time by looking at you all, whether you're hearing what I'm saying. But even Indians I know very well, I cannot always tell. Almost never can I tell if they agree with me. And sometimes I can't tell if they are even listening to me. But if you just keep on patiently talking and doing just ordinary things with them and treating them like everybody else, then the time will come when they will accept you. But Genevieve said she was standing, I think this was in Union City after they moved some Indian families in down there.
It was just a few days.
Yeah, and anyway, this one Indian boy hadn't been responding to anything. And so Genevieve was standing in the door of the classroom, and one of them came up and I think just hit her like this. An Indian boy did, and one of the other teachers said, my word, he's getting a little, too familiar. And she said, no, he isn't. He has just now accepted me. And this is so important in even dealing with as I do. We have lots of Indians. I'm always pleased about this. When I go to library meetings, they say Indians won't come into public libraries. I want them to come see ours. We have lots of Indian customers that I'm very happy about.
We have a paper boy, I think it's Arapaho. We call him Gabby. He can't get a single word out of it. I'm really glad I know how to ask you.
You just don't let it bother you.
Don't rush.
No, and don't rush them because they can't. But so much of, and actually a lot of it, or some of it, I've learned from reading Mr. Seger's book about the way he was with the Indians, and John Miles was, and Darlington were both this way too. They understood the Indian and they loved the Indian. They were the first two agents. Then the next agent was Dyer, and he did not understand the Indians, and they didn't understand him, so he soon left. He was not there very long. Now, after, do you know what date your grandfather came to Darlington? I'm not sure.
No, I don't. Right now, I have it in material, and I didn't bring this morning what I thought I was bringing.
Well, you can bring it some other time, and I'll copy it all. They can come down and read it. But I think it was, I know that it was before 1872,
Yes.
because I have some letters, some original letters written in 1872, and some pictures that the people brought me, and this I'm going to pass around. This is a picture of the Darlington School, and one of the men on here was Mr. Seger. All they can come down and read it. But I think it was, I know that it was before 1872,
Yes.
because I have some letters, some original letters written in 1872, and some pictures that the people brought me, and this I'm going to pass around. This is a picture of the Darlington School, and one of the men on here was Mr. Seger. Maybe, Genevieve, you can figure out.
I don't
you
know.
haven't. You don't know which one it is either. Well, he'd
Well, I
be the
would with
short
a
magnifying glass. Do you? I have never known.
I never have paid any attention, but it was the Arapaho Indian School. Now, part of the time, they had to keep the Cheyenne children separated from the Arapaho children because there was lots and lots of rivalry. Lots of rivalry.
Another thing, and something else that I was going to suggest about what you said. Oh, about the way when he insisted that the Indians, see if you can tell, Genevieve, there, the Indian children be fed first. It seems to me this would appeal to the Indian parents, because from everything I've read, the Indians really loved their children, particularly the Arapahoes. The one on the end, all right. The one on the
There's a
end.
man on the end.
Mr. Seger, right here, and I'll let you look at this picture.
You say Quaker, is that the same as the Moon?
No, oh no, the Quakers,
Yes,
were in the
that's
far
Darlington
east.
School.
no, they were not,
Still over there? It was.
No.
they were the ones that said thee and thy and all love and kindness.
Well, the,
They were founded by George Fox in England, and started this being on the same level with their servants and their And
Yes,
not
that-
believe in slavery. However, when they came to Pennsylvania, they did have slaves.
They did.
So they were, later on, they freed them. I've been studying because I was assigned to live in teaching children in Philadelphia, and I had an opportunity to
Oh, how
go back and
wonderful.
see some of their original homes that the first click meeting house in the United States is still in Philadelphia. Excuse me to get my hand in.
No, that's
Oh.
interesting.
He realized, John Seger realized that they were going to have to teach the children to speak some English. And they had many interpreters, and they did start teaching the children to speak English. And he applied himself to such an extent that he spoke Cheyenne and Arapaho in sign language fluently. And his son, who was the first white child born at Darlington, also spoke Cheyenne and Arapaho fluently. In fact, there were Indians that came to our house many times into his office and would quarrel over how a word was pronounced. And he would say, well, now the northern Cheyenne pronounced it this way, but the southern Cheyenne pronounced it this way, so your family is quarreling over something that there's no quarrel over. And I am very sad that I had the opportunity to learn both languages, and it was a disappointment to my father. I understand Cheyenne Arapaho reasonably well, but I do not speak it very well, and I do fairly well in sign language. But it is a shame that we don't take advantage of those opportunities.
It was not written, Robert.
No, no, it was necessary. What? Tents and, yes, and teepees and places of that sort. And they traveled and moved around from place to place.
Sorry, right over here, I have a lot of
Did they have a problem with health?
Look like,
No, they were dirty and had a lot of diseases, and there was lots of sickness,
We'll talk about that.
but they were very kind to their older people.
So when they came to Oklahoma, they knew nothing about finding a harvest, did they?
No, they did not. Now, Mr. Seger said, now, these students can spend a certain time in the classroom, but let's take them out and cut wood. And they said, oh, no, these boys cannot cut wood. Oh, no, men do not. Now, most of these students were boys. These cannot cut wood. They will never allow it. You'll cause trouble. And he was advised against it. So one day he took them out and he showed them how to chop wood. And he said, now the one that chops the most wood can be the chief. So they all chopped and worked real hard in carrying in the wood. And so then they designated the chief. And he used various little ways of the way they believed, to get them to do it. And so the next day, their mothers came in and said, now you tell us what you want done. We don't want our boys doing women's work. We will do it for them. And he said, you go home. I'm big chief here, and you go to your chief out in camp. But I'm big chief here, and you have to do what big chief says here. And these boys are going to chop wood. So then they started planting some crops and taking care of some hay. And then he arranged so they could be paid for fixing the firewood. So before, they'd always had trouble having enough firewood. But they had plenty of firewood, and they didn't have any trouble with the boys because they were busy, and they were hungry at mealtime, and they were ready for bed at night, and they were learning at the same time. It was a combination. And so one year, he had them plant watermelons, and when they came in from their buffalo hunt, he told the boys, now, we'll divide the watermelons up, and only the families who had boys in school that helped plant these watermelons could have them. So when they came in from this buffalo hunt, they sorted out their parents and lined them up, each boy with his parents. And it turned out that each had 7 watermelons. And that perhaps was the first time that the Indians and the whites had participated in a watermelon feast.
That's a fabulous story. She's telling me things now that I haven't heard before. I was hoping this would happen, but again, all of this, he was a wonderful psychologist.
That was
And
his
he's never heard
point.
of the word, probably.
Well, he perhaps had, because he was an avid reader. He read everything. And a professor at Princeton that heard him make a lecture, he was an interesting lecturer. He just fascinated people. He could have made a fortune going through the East lecturing, but he preferred to stay in the West. And this Princeton professor wrote in a letter, and I have not been able to find the letter, but as a little girl, I remember having it read and talked about, said that he had as much education, while not formal, as though he had a doctorate, because his spelling was poor and sometimes his grammar wasn't too good. But he knew how to do the job, and he understood the Indian and made a point to understand him. Now, one summer, he went out and lived with the Indians. He told them if they would do things that he wanted them to do, to teach them about the white man, he was willing, as a white man, to learn the things that the Indians did. And he perfected the languages and learned their way. Such as saying, why do you toe in when you walk? White man walks this way. Why do you toe in? Well, we toe in because as we go along the very narrow trail, we would stumble. We would catch our toes on grass roots and on objects along the way. So we toe in and travel on this very narrow path. And things of that sort that he actually learned in camp, and he ate the food with them and partook of the very things, and he kept his word. And that's one thing they always said, that John Seger kept his word. And that is one thing we do not always do today with the Indian.
You know Indian sign for a liar?
To this day, the sign for agent is this, because Brenton Darlington pulled out his false teeth. They didn't fit and they hurt him. And he was always pulling them out and putting them back in, and then that's what the Indians remembered, was that the agent kept taking his teeth out and in, and so that became a sign. That's how all signs started, is through some...
All of the sign language
all
started.
sign language started was that you could... That became universal language.
All white people should be able to take the teeth out.
Yes, they thought that that was a... And then there was another one they thought was sort of magic. He had two false teeth in front and pull them out on his tongue some way. And when he wanted to get somebody to do something, to scare a little boy, he'd start pushing his teeth out. And the boy began to think there was magic involved.
You ever hear about that evangelist that went to Darlington one time, and boy, he whooped and hollered and ran and screamed and everything one time? Had to pull out. Next night, nobody there. Went around, what was the matter? He thought he was mad at it.
And at Darlington, for many years, there was a huge grove of cottonwoods. And John Seger began to plant trees. Before then, they hadn't decided to actually plant trees. And so really, your agricultural and mechanical school started at Darlington. Perhaps was the first actual industrial school in Oklahoma. And then when he was sent to secret colony and take the Indians that were the renegades that nobody could take care
I
of.
think you have time to tell us a little bit about why he went to Seger Colony.
And he was sent out there to take these Indians that nobody else could do anything with. And he said, well, I'm willing, but I have to know that I'll be backed up for a number of years, because if I go out there, it means that I'll have to give the rest of my life. You can't just work a year or two. And he went out and chose a spot on Cobb Creek out in Washita County and started this school, now from Wedford, 14 miles from Wedford. And he proceeded to build this school, and he did all sorts of things for the children. Here is a picture of John Seger and an Indian child with a deer. He fenced in a park where the children could go out and play with the deer. And one time, my mother was an Eastern woman, And she came west. She was one of 4 children, 4 daughters. The father and the mother died. And there was 4 uncles and aunts took the daughters. And my mother was the prettiest one and the most vivacious. And she was sent to Washington, D.C. to live with the uncle and aunt that was in government service. And she was brought up with servants and every luxury. But she was being forced to marry a young man who was high in government affairs and whom she didn't care for. So when she was supposed to be going to parties, she went to a night school to study kindergarten. And she finally got her certificate, and through a friend of the family in the Indian department, they fixed it up so she got a job out in Montana. And she went out to teach little Indian children. And this uncle and aunt almost disowned her. But she got pneumonia out there, and it was too cold for her. And then she went to Wyoming and out in there. And so they said that she didn't want to go back to Washington. In the meantime, the uncle and aunt forgave her. But she was sent to Colony, and that was my grandfather's school. And of course, my father was his oldest son, and Mr. Seger sent all his children away to school. They had an education. He realized the necessity of it. And Neatha had come back, and there was a need for an Indian trader store at that time. And so his eldest son was running this store. And when my mother came as a teacher, my father saw her the first day in church, and she always dressed real pretty. She still got Eastern things. And he looked at her and said, "I'm going to marry her." And my grandfather established, one of the things he did when he first established the school was to see if they had a church. And they did have a church. And a relative of Muriel Wright, the historian, was one of the ministers out there. And so my father and mother had their first church wedding in Washita County at this little Seger Indian school. And every Sunday morning, she was told when she arrived on a Thursday that Sunday she would have to be in church. It didn't make any difference unless she was sick enough to be in the infirmary, as they called it, not hospital. So she went to church, and all the Indian men and boys sat on one side of the church, and all the Indian women and Indian girls sat on the other side of the church. Well, they had this church wedding, and it was in December 30th, and that was between the holiday season when they were out there vacation. And the church was trimmed in green, and she wore a green dress, and there were some friends came from Anadarko and around, and they had quite a wedding. And so when they got ready to leave, they had, my father had a fine buggy and nice horses. So everyone assumed that they would go to Weatherford, 14 miles to the railroad. They were going to spend their honeymoon in the capital of Guthrie. So the horse and rig was out in front of the church, and so everybody rushed out and thought they would go there. And instead, they took another one from the back of the church. And all those things are so interesting. Now they perhaps don't seem so exciting, but when you think that it was just out from nowhere, the roads were bad. And oftentimes when he was raising his family out of the colony, he'd be gone 2 weeks coming over here to Darlington to get rations. The river would come up, and they had to ford the river. There was no bridges. And it was really the wildest kind. And the Indians were always kind to his family, always kind. There was never a time that my grandmother feared the Indians. And they divided and were generous. One time they ran out of sugar, and the different various Indians came and gave them half of what they had, and then they had more than the Indians had. But there was that kind feeling.
I get kind of goose pimply. Do you? When she talks about this kind of thing and about the people and the courage that it took. I think that this is partially responsible for our characters, the personality of most of the people that live in Oklahoma. You've had this happen to you. I know people come here. Well, we're friendly, aren't we, Victoria?
Mm-hmm.
She's just new here. Oh, I wish we had some more time. Genevieve,